Let me introduce our next speaker. This is Alexi Kukuljevic, and he's a philosopher and an artist. He's assistant professor at the Art Theory Department of the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, and author of the book Liquidation World on the Art of Living Absently, published with MIT Press, and he's currently working on a next book called Like Hell It Is, on horror and hilarity. Welcome, Alexi.
Yeah, thank you, Helmut, and well, thanks for bearing with me after 3 hours of intensity already. This is not part of the book project, but it could be, given its sort of subject matter, namely, well, the prince of the infernal regions, namely the devil himself. So I'll just leap directly in. By the end of the 18th century, belief in the devil had been reduced, if not to nothing, then next to nil. A relic of what the narrator of Henry Fielding's comic novel, Tom Jones, could refer to in 1749 as the days of superstition. And I quote the novel, "To say truth, the whole furniture of the infernal regions hath long been appropriated by the managers of playhouses, who seem lately to have lain them by as rubbish, capable only of affecting the upper gallery, a place in which few of our readers ever sit." The death of the devil, to borrow Schock's formulation, had become a social fact, and toward the end of the century, even the simple folk of the upper gallery had lost the force of their conviction, as the diminutive comic stage of the puppet shows of Covent Garden attest. It is there that the devil suffers the ignominy of being slain with but a stick by the puppet Punch. And I quote from a popular poem, "The devil with his pitchfork fought, while Punch had but a stick, sir, but killed the devil as he ought. Huzzah, there's old Nick, sir." Yet before Punch could vanquish the devil with a stick on the fairground stage, the devil had been struck a series of cerebral blows, none more decisive than that of Descartes, nor more lethal than that of Spinoza. If the epoch of the Enlightenment begins with Descartes' effort to definitively neutralize the malicious demon by placing the cogito beyond the reaches of his cunning, it culminates with Spinoza's reduction of the devil to a mere phantom of an intellect inadequately emendated. Neither magician nor priest, the philosopher does not exorcise the devil by spell or rite, but excises his being by divine decree of the natural light, which is to say, with Spinoza, by natural right. The Enlightenment, believing that reason alone was its guide, banishes the devil to the realm of fable. Condemned to the imaginary by reason's faithful, belief in the devil becomes the telltale symptom of the subject's detachment from reality and attachment to what Poe, in his poem The Raven, terms a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, a flight from modernity and the new confidences it requires as price of admission. More confident in reason's capacities to tame the forces of nature, modern man believes himself better off directing his fear toward a more pressing foe, painfully aware of being a dupe of social rather than cosmic forces. In a letter to Hugo Boxall, Spinoza expresses this shift in mentality humorously, allowing Boxall to fill in the blank. And this is Spinoza. "It seems to me that blank offers their wares for sale in the same way shopkeepers do, who always show the worst goods first. They say the devil is a very cunning fellow, but it seems to me that their mind far surpasses his in craftiness." However, in the 19th century, and particularly in the wake of the French Revolution, faith in reason begins to falter, and the devil undergoes a scandalous transmutation of value as a response to the consolidation of bourgeois society, the rise of the giant modern industry, colonial expansion, and the emergence of the global market. No longer just a figure of wrong, but of one who has been wronged, the devil registers a new feeling of horror engendered by the erosion, if not collapse, of the social bond. The reduction of, quote, all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations to the abject form of what Marx and Engels aptly term callous cash payment engenders the peculiarity of a subject with an attachment to the horrors of yesteryear, the recollection of an old horror, a relic of the days of superstition, snuffed out by the age of enlightenment. The devil is, to borrow a formulation from Adorno and Horkheimer, an image of horror to withstand horror. The devil no longer serves to veil but lay bare the true horror of so-called civilization, returning to it in imaginary form the very thing it has ruthlessly annihilated. More déclassé than prole, the devil belongs to that dangerous class, the social scum, that passively rotting mass thrown off from the lower layers of old society. I'm quoting Marx here. So the devil is at home in the rubbish heap to which he has been consigned. The devil marks a return then, not just of the socially repressed, but the socially annihilated. So this broad and woefully insufficient historical sketch allows me to plot 3 moments that attest to the scandal of the devil as a scandal internal to reason itself. So these 3 moments then will be that of Descartes, Spinoza, and then I'll turn at the end to Edgar Allan Poe. So the first moment. At the end of the first of his meditations on first philosophy, Descartes hypothesizes the existence of a devil that he describes as a malicious demon of utmost power and cunning. This hypothesis puts the devil's essentially nefarious purpose to good theoretical use as a means of rendering his method of doubt hyperbolic to the extreme. This method consists in treating anything that is not certain and indubitable as patently false, no matter how reasonable the judgment, customary the opinion, or solid the belief. Having consigned the whole of sensory perception, the entirety of natural philosophy, and thus everything predicated upon the assumption of their real existence to doubt, Descartes proceeds to imperil the certitude of the field of mathematics, and thus the knowledge whose reasonability depends upon its logical entailment and not on its existence in nature. Strategically reversing his method, Descartes proposes to pretend for a time, rather than doubt, that there exists a supreme being of deceit, imagining, in effect, a God whose goodness is itself in doubt. Descartes strips the idea of omnipotence of any rational criterion, fathoming a world as an elaborate con, a trap for the thinking subject's credulity that ensnares all cognition, making the mind stumble in and through its very operation. If all that we believe to be true is false, if necessity is itself contingency, if causality is essentially arbitrary, then we are deceived not only in fact, but in principle. Descartes' evil genius reduces the whole of reason to an imaginary effect such that we misrecognize the true as false. The scandalous prospect of this hypothesis consists in making the devil not only the cause of all cognitive lapses, and not just the source of all error, but the very source of the belief in the difference between error and truth. Lapsus itself, in this malign scenario, becomes truth. By making the devil capable of even making the subject imagine the true to be false, right? 2 plus 3 equals 5. Descartes foists upon the subject the prospect of his complete and total subjection to an other that thinks in his place. The devil, in short, becomes the author of each of the cogito's thoughts. If the I is fundamentally deceived, if I think equals I err, then the act of thought positions the I as other, as deceived about what it thinks in each of its acts. The scandal of this fable consists in Descartes imagining a case of demonic possession, which is not just a matter of the possession of the body, but the total seizure of the soul. It is as if the mind is demented from within and not merely perverted from without. The hypothesis requires that the subject treat the whole of nature, physical and mental, sensible and intelligible, as a simulacrum. Now, this is what Jacques Derrida, in his Auseinandersetzung with Michel Foucault, in this sort of, famous conflict with Michel Foucault, refers to as the prospect of the mind's total madness. And I quote Derrida, "Now, the recourse to the fiction of the evil genius will conjure up the possibility of a total madness, a total derangement over which I could have no control because it is inflicted upon me, hypothetically, leaving me no responsibility for it. Total derangement is the possibility of a madness that is no longer a disorder of the body, of the object, the body object outside the boundaries of the res cogitans, outside the boundaries of the police city, secure in its existence as thinking subjectivity, but is a madness that will bring subversion to pure thought and to its purely intelligible objects, to the field of its clear and distinct ideas, to the realm of the mathematical truths which escape natural doubt." Okay, so that's Derrida. The hypothesis suggests that reason does not simply have an external limit, but an internal limit. If the former is touched, belief in reason is by no means compromised. In other words, just the external limit. It leaves belief in reason itself intact. It is such a belief that allows for a whole host of beliefs, most pertinently here, belief in the devil, to subsist without undermining in principle reason's reasonableness. For there is no absolute, definitive cut between reason and belief, between reason and the reasonable. As Foucault himself stresses, citing Montaigne's essays as his witness, in the classical age, before the age of reason, and I'm quoting Foucault here, there was nothing to assure him that all thought was not haunted by the ghosts of unreason. As Montaigne himself writes, there is nothing in the whole world madder than bringing matters down to the measure of our own capacities and potentialities. In a world defined by belief, more or less reasonable, there is no encounter with a truth that violently shakes the whole of being, evacuating it of its sense. In such a world, reason may challenge this or that belief, but not belief as such and as a whole, not the very form of belief, for it is this form that serves to place the subject who reasons in relation to a whole which thought ultimately confirms. The event, as Foucault puts it, that takes place between Montaigne and Descartes concerns the advent of a new ratio. This ratio, reason, severs reason from the form of belief, making it unreasonable, or at least unbecoming to reason about beings that are beyond reason. For Foucault, this rupture announced by Descartes constitutes reason through the exclusion of madness and, by extension, demonic possession from thinking itself. This is Foucault, an impossibility of being mad, which is inherent in the thinking subject rather than the object of thought. According to Foucault, the hypothesis of the evil genius does not does nothing to thwart this constitution, since it is thoroughly staged and thus controlled in advance, a voluntary exercise that never truly threatens the mastery and control of the thinking subject. Right? So this is basically the crux of the debate between Foucault and Derrida. So the subject may be deceived insofar as he believes, but the subject cannot be made to believe. Right? As he puts it, everything is perhaps illusion, but with no credulity, with no belief. So the meditating subject does not believe himself truly possessed. This is, of course, the very point of Descartes' hypothetical exercise. The subject can imagine himself within the space of total delusion, but the subject does not lose a sense of himself. Inside this delusion, there is an outside whose place is held by the subject. This is Foucault. And even if it is not in my power to know any truth, this is Descartes. And even if it is not in my power to know any truth, I shall at least do what is in my power, that is, resolutely guard against assenting to any falsehoods, so that the deceiver, however powerful and cunning he may be, will be unable to impose on me in the slightest degree. So Descartes thereby opens up a gap between man and thought, a gap that renders the latter, thought immune to madness. And this is Foucault. While man can still go mad, thought, as the sovereign exercise carried out by a subject seeking truth, can no longer be devoid of reason. All of man's thoughts may indeed signify possession, but thought itself cannot be dispossessed of its ratio. A fiction that is legible as a fiction is not, at least, wholly fictional. The fiction itself makes sense, and this sense depends on a constitutive differentiation between the fiction and its opposite, what is not a fiction. It is this negative place that the subject holds open through its doubt, its refusal to give assent. The subject who imagines such a total fiction may imagine his own absence, but cannot eliminate his place, which makes sense of this absence within the fiction. This subject is thus signified within the fiction as absent, or in Descartes' explicit terms, as deceived. The imaginary effort to reduce all to the imaginary leaves the place signified by the subject absent. This whole in the scenario cannot itself be sealed by the demonic other, since the subject, in being subject to demonic deception, remains present if only through the sign of its absence. The subject's absence must itself be signified for the nonsense of the reign of falsity itself to make sense. Derrida suggests that the fantasy of total deception, of complete demonic dispossession of the subject's hold on itself and on truth, makes sense only in its failure to do so. This is the odd truth of Descartes' insight, that the subject can imagine itself deceived, but in doing so is not deceived about the deception. The consistency of the fantasy, that is, of total deception, depends upon the subject remaining blind to the inconsistency of the scenario. The subject is not deceived, in other words, about the deception. In Derridian terms, Descartes exhibits the fable's impossibility as constitutive of its possibility. The fiction cannot efface itself as a fiction, leaving present the trace of its inscription and thus a sign of its imaginary status. The space of fiction is exceeded from within by means of the absent presence of the subject. By imagining a scenario that definitively annihilates the object of truth, Descartes marks the presence and the absence of the subject. It is this mark of the subject that Lacan suggests Descartes himself evades. So if the cunning and power of this devil consists in the supreme conceit of making the subject believe in the world of its senses and trust in the mechanisms of its cognition, then the very fact that it is he who presides over the subject's inscription makes belief and trust signify their opposite, namely disbelief and distrust. Believing in this fiction, the subject no longer believes. By trusting in it, he no longer trusts. This is the devil's work, his rational accomplishment. The devil brings to the fore language's singular perversity, the inscription of the subject within a fiction that is total forces upon this subject the truth of the oddity of the subject's place. The subject who imagines a world where all that is believed signifies the opposite cannot itself believe in this world. The subject's subjection to the demon's utmost power and cunning is thus neither total nor absolute. The subject is not where it believes itself to be. In not being deceived about this deception, the subject does not conform to the form of belief. Not even a malicious demon of utmost power can make the subject believe that there is no truth, that all is false. Right? One cannot believe that all is false. The demonic truth is itself a fiction, and only a subject that truly encounters its inconsistency excises the grip of this demon. It is the dramatic revelation of this point of inconsistency that marks the truth, that marks the true denouement of Descartes' methodic procedure. For the statement itself, all is false, remains strictly speaking undecidable. If it is true that all is false, then the true cannot be true. However, if the statement is false, then the statement itself is false, which entails that all is not false. It is the devil, not God, that occasions such an apprehension, namely that truth is of the order of inconsistency. Okay. So that's the Descartes section. Now, moving on to Spinoza. So the second moment within this sort of trajectory of the Enlightenment. Spinoza attempts to eliminate the possibility of such inconsistency by undermining from the outset the devil's relation to reason. No philosopher has attempted to establish with greater rigor that everything viewed from the perspective of eternity, right, subspecies eternitatis, is riveted of necessity to its place. Right? So viewed from the perspective of eternity, everything is riveted of necessity to its place. Each thing is as it is, each moment that it is, in absolute accord with its nature. As Spinoza tells Blienberg, I'm going to pronounce it that way. It's probably, or Blienberg, but I'm certainly not correct. But as Spinoza tells Blienberg in their infamous exchange concerning the existence of evil, this is Spinoza, when we consider God's decree and his nature, we can no more affirm of a blind man than of a stone that he is deprived of vision. For at that time, vision no more pertains to the man, right, to that man without contradiction than it does to the stone, since nothing more pertains to that man and is his than what the divine intellect will attribute to him. So what we term privation, right, in this case blindness, right, Spinoza stresses is neither an action nor something, and thus is nothing real. It is, quote, only the pure and simple lack, which in itself is nothing, Spinoza. So for Spinoza, the devil, as an essentially deprived being, will be nothing but the cosmic projection of the human being's own immiseration. A being that believes in devils is a miserable being indeed. Spinoza makes the point with philosophical economy and rigor, as we shall see in a moment, but he also makes the point with splendid wit and humor. In a letter to, quote, a most noble young man, Albert Berg, a recent convert from the Protestant faith and now ardent defender of the Roman Catholic Church, Spinoza addresses Berg's accusation that he himself had been led astray by the prince of wicked spirits, right? So that basically Berg is accusing Spinoza himself as being led astray by the devil. And Spinoza reminds the young man who is truly bewitched and of the absurdities to which the belief in the devil can lead. One can only dream of the prince, an enemy of God, this is Spinoza, with the power to deceive at the cost of imagining a God as odious as inconsistent. If we dream of a God who not only allows such a deception to occur, but punishes those whom he allows to be deceived by handing them over to the very being who deceived them for eternal torture, we are dreaming of a God hardly worthy of worship. Alluding to Gaspard de Coligny, the Count of Châtillon, namely the Huguenot general who, while at war with the Spanish Catholics in Belgium, in a show of contempt, fed the Eucharist to his horses, Spinoza writes, this is Spinoza, would these absurdities still have to be tolerated if you worshipped an infinite and eternal God instead of the one to whom Châtillon with impunity fed to his horses in the city of Tienen? And you weep that I am wretched? You call my philosophy, which you have never seen, a fable. O young man bereft of understanding, who has bewitched you so that you believe you are eating the highest and eternal being and have him in your intestines? That's Spinoza. So in another exchange of letters with Hugo Boxall, Spinoza playfully mocks Boxall's open unreason. Not one to be bewitched, Spinoza believes neither in devils, witches, ghosts, or mythological monsters, nor in spirits of any kind, male or female. Slightly more enlightened than Berg, Boxall grants that devils are the stuff of fable, even adding female spirits too, since spirits, he suggests, cannot reproduce. However, this is Boxall, he argues that spirits of male gender exist. And Spinoza responds, quote, I'm surprised that those who've seen spirits naked have not cast their eyes on their genitalia. Perhaps they were afraid to do so. Perhaps they didn't know about this difference. So Spinoza ridicules the use that Boxall makes of his imagination, praising at least the courage of his perverse tendency to not simply stare the spirit in the face, but to take in the fullness of his naked presence. Spinoza is clearly having fun. He concludes the letter with a remarkable definition of the philosopher as one who weighs, quote, the effects of the imagination and affects and laughs at them. However, on a more serious note, Spinoza argues that the idea of spirits in and of themselves, unlike the idea of geometrical entities, contain nothing that is not derivable from the imagination. He says, this is a quote, I can't consider them as anything other than dreams, which are unlike God, which are as unlike God as being is unlike non-being. Spinoza. So despite Spinoza's relegation of spirits to non-being, and thus objects of philosophical derision, in the short treatise on God, man, and his well-being, Spinoza nevertheless includes a chapter entitled On Devils, which includes the following syllogism. If the devil is a thing that is completely contrary to God and has nothing from God, then he agrees precisely with nothing. Okay, that's the syllogism. If the devil is a thing that is completely contrary to God and has nothing from God, then he agrees precisely with nothing. You could say all that is missing in the treatise is the QED, quid ergo demonstrum, of the ethics. So Spinoza claims that we cannot form any intelligible, but only imaginary properties of spirits or ghosts. However, the devil does appear to have such properties. And in the short treatise, Spinoza begins with the idea of the devil, that is, with the supposed intelligible properties. However, from the outset, these properties are derived not from the devil himself, but from God's negation. Superstition is here attacked then at its root, whereby an imagined determination derived from an idea's negation appears as an idea when it is in reality not an idea but an image. So in other words, it appears as if I have an idea of the devil, but this idea is imaginary, since it implies the negation of the idea of God. The devil is the opposite of the idea of God, and as such, not an idea at all. Spinoza suggests that the idea of the devil derives from the erroneous effort to imagine God. So the idea of God, Spinoza claims, is, as he puts it, as clear as it is obscure. It is in this respect as clear, as clear as an idea of a triangle, but whereas an image of a triangle is distinct, the image of God is obscure. That's what Spinoza says. So as he puts it to Boxall, we can't imagine God, but we can understand him. So if the devil's image derives from the negation of God who lacks an image, the devil is, for Spinoza, we could say, doubly obscure. This obscurity takes the form then of a pseudo-definition. The devil for Spinoza is defined as, quote, as I put in this, as we can infer from the syllogism, right? The devil for Spinoza is defined as completely contrary to and has nothing from God. The devil is not only defined by a negation, right, but an absolute negation, completely contrary, and is thus a relation that is, nevertheless, not related to God, and thus has, quote, has nothing from God, right? So he's both completely contrary and has nothing from God. Spinoza then defines the devil as a negation that is not a relation, right? And this conceals a contradiction, a relation and, in other words, a relation and a non-relation. The devil is a contradictory being, a being that can neither be conceived nor imagined, a being that cannot be a being, a truly contradictory being. Spinoza concludes the proof by stating that he, namely the devil, agrees precisely with nothing. Since he is defined by an essential lack of being, to know the devil is to know he cannot be. I think it's almost like an inverse ontological proof. He cannot even, strictly speaking, be imagined. This nothing, about which one can only misspeak, thus admits of no agreement. As a nothing, he agrees precisely with nothing. If one speaks about this nothing, one will reason falsely. The other of knowledge, such an object which is not an object, presents the intellect, namely the devil, presents the intellect with an impossible object, confronting the intellect with a thing that cannot be in agreement with it. To admit even the devil's hypothetical existence is to admit that the difference between something and nothing is itself neither something nor nothing, a thing that is other than reason, but not absolutely other to reason, for it cannot be spoken about. But when one does so, one speaks about nothing but a word. I think this is the ultimate claim. Right? So if the devil was other than he is, and did in fact exist, Spinoza hypothesizes with ferocious humor, then he would be a being quite miserable, so impoverished that he ought not to solicit our consummate horror and fear, but our sympathy, if not our prayers, right? If prayers, of course, could help. Yet prayers for Spinoza cannot help. It is thus senseless to grant the devil even a hypothetical existence. To do so risks violating reason's integrity. The devil's inexistence is thus not only a fact, it cannot be otherwise. To even suppose that such a miserable thing could exist grants the devil a possible existence, yet no such thing is conceivable. If being is itself a perfection, as Spinoza maintains, and the duration of a thing's existence depends upon its degree of perfection, as Spinoza argues, a being such as the devil that singularly lacks perfection cannot exist, not even for an instant. The devil's duration is reduced to nil. The devil is absolutely relative, necessarily absent, for his presence would admit contingency into the act of cognition itself, which for Spinoza amounts to the denial of cognition, as if saying that one does not understand what one understands. The devil is a fiction defined by its impossibility. It is thus a pure fiction. It is a signifier that signifies nothing. The devil is a being that can neither be conceived nor imagined with consistency. It is of the essence of the devil to not only inexist, but to fail to appear. His lack of appearance is the devil's only way of appearing. The devil, in short, is a being that is not one, because he lacks any consistent form. The one who imagines the devil is in reality one who renders human privation divine, imagining God in the image of man. The one who attributes evil to such a being is the one who is truly evil, if evil existed, which for Spinoza it does not. So to think the devil is to think his essential contradiction, a being incompatible with reason, a being that can only be presented as the thing it is not. The devil is the placeholder of the impossible, of two double negations, not man, and not God. A truly specious invention. To allude to Spinoza's letter to William van Bliesenberg on March 13th, 1665, concerning the nature of evil, we could say the devil hangs himself of his own lack of accord. So this is the letter. It is as if someone were to ask, if it agreed better with the nature of someone to hang himself, would there be reason why he should not hang himself? But suppose it were possible that there should be such a nature, then I say, whether I grant free will or not, that if anyone sees that he can live better on the gallows than at his table, he would act foolishly if he did not go hang himself. One who saw clearly that in fact he would enjoy a better and more perfect life or essence by being a knave than by following virtue would also be a fool if he were not a knave. For acts of knavery would be virtue in relation to such a perverted human nature. If we suppose a nature superlatively imperfect, which is to say perfectly imperfect, we imagine the saddest, least powerful of beings. We imagine a being, in short, that fails to be. The devil perishes of his own lack of being. Liquidated by a corrosive use of logic, the devil is but a word, and thus perhaps even less than a figment of the imagination, for it is a word without image, mere letters without sense. The devil is a signifier that signifies nothing precisely. Okay, so that's the end of the Spinoza section. Now on to Edgar Allan Poe. And for the purposes of this, I'm I'm going to include the sort of passage that I'm focusing on. Oh, freeze, is that right? The last one? Sorry. Okay.
It went to sleep.
Oh, it's okay. Just have a momentary pause here. It'll be helpful to have the image of the passage, just because, yeah, it'll make it easier to follow what I want to argue here. Okay. So, yeah, I apologize for the image, but basically I'm just focusing on the top paragraph of the Poe story, which is the story Bon Bon, which is not a very well-known Poe story, but a great one. Okay. It is the precision of the devil's inconsistency that interests Edgar Allan Poe, the most enlightened of all romantics. In Poe, the devil is not to be believed, but his phantasmatic presence is no less real for its lack of reality. Poe procures for the devil a place within modernity, taking full advantage of his purported absence. Poe does not only mark the absent presence of the devil within modernity, by marking the presence of this absence, he details his continued effects. The devil is not the other of reason, but its interstice, reason's interstice, supernatural and natural, immaterial and material, eminently rational and woefully irrational. A demon or a daemon that is not good. The devil is not the cause of loss, but he who makes it legible. The devil is a good devil. He is, to allude to another Poe story, the angel of the odd. It is in one of Poe's lesser-known tales, Bon Bon, titled with precision, that Poe recasts the devil as a being whose cunning does not entail maliciousness. The story, in its final form, is named for its character Pierre Bon Bon, an equally gifted chef and philosopher, or so we are told, for whom, quote, the powers of the intellect held intimate connection with the capabilities of his stomach. In possession of a sublimely rotund belly, a diminutively puny head, and, quote, and barely 3 feet in height, Bon Bon is a grotesque embodiment of the philosopher who thinks with his belly. Neither a Platonist, Aristotelian, nor Leibnizian, neither classical nor modern, right? And these are all things that are, stated within the story. Bon Bon, we learn, is not one to waste his energies, better spent over a fricassee or a facili gradu in frivolous speculation. And as it turns out, a facili gradu doesn't exist. So a metaphysician who is nonetheless chiefly concerned with the analysis of sensation, who reasons a priori and a posteriori, and whose ideas are innate or otherwise, again, that's a quote from Poe, Bon Bon is a philosophical contradiction, belonging to the schools of the Ionic and Italic, right, which could refer to both Italy and, of course, just the use of italics that are throughout the story, a school, in short, of its own. Bon Bon is a philosopher, we could say, in name alone. A school without a need of a school, because there can only be one member. Bon Bon was emphatically a bonbonist. That's the story. So less a lover of wisdom, however, than a lover of a good bargain and drink, Bon Bon lets these drives get the better of him while in dialogue with the devil. So despite being a philosopher of some renown, reputedly responsible for Kant's metaphysics, an assertion that ought, in and of itself, give the reader pause, right? Since it can be debated whether Kant has a metaphysics, Bon unwisely attempts to sell his soul to the devil on the cheap. Yet the devil himself is not interested in a good bargain. Too much the gentleman, too refined in his tastes, having shucked from their shell souls of much greater philosophical acumen, the devil declines so uncouth an offer, unwilling to take advantage of Bon's drunken state. In the devil's words, quote, your present disgusting and ungentlemanly situation. In other words, the devil is no merchant. So this devil is not interested in exchange, but in the taste of souls, not the uses to which they can be put, but their material qualities. He is not just an Epicurean, as we're told, but as he tells Bon, I am Epicurus. I am Epicurus. Right? And the I is italicized. However, he is not just a philosopher. He is the source of the most peculiar of philosophical deviations. Not just the thinker of the clinomen, but the clinomen itself, the devil, Poe suggests, is that which causes the I in I am Epicurus to be italicized. He is what is singular in the proper name, whereas Bon himself may be, quote, the most superfluous of metaphysicians, which happens to be the judgment of Bon's own cat. The devil is metaphysical superfluity in and for itself. So the source of the oddest and least necessary of ideas, it is the devil, quote, this is Poe, who told Aristotle that by sneezing men expelled superfluous ideas through the proboscis. And the devil is the one who bade Plato to write down onus estin aulos. Right? So this is going to be the focus of this passage now that I'm going to interpret. Right? So we learn that the devil is the one who basically told Plato to write down onus estin aulos. Right? So only readers who read truly to the letter can pick up on the devil's joke here. So let me quote the passage in full, and this is the one at the top here. You knew Plato, Bon? Ah, no, I beg 1,000 pardons. He met me at Athens one day in the Parthenon and told me he was distressed for an idea. I bade him write down that onus esti aulos. He said that he would do so and went home while I stepped over to the pyramids. But my conscience smote me for having uttered a truth, even to aid a friend. And hastening back to Athens, I arrived behind the philosopher's chair as he was inditing the aulos. Right? Giving the lamma a fillip with my finger, I turned it upside down. So the sentence now reads, onus estin augos, right? I pause there because, in fact, that's not a gamma, right? So, and is, you perceive, the fundamental doctrine of his metaphysics, right? So, in the passage, in the joke, will sort of depend upon a movement from the first in the nous estin aulos. What appears to be a lambda is, in fact, not a lambda, right? Then it gets repeated as a lambda, right? This is referred to as a lamma, right, which doesn't exist, right? Only a lambda exists, right? And then in the end, the correction results in augos, right? But in fact, this gamma is not an actual gamma, right? Okay. So I'm going to go through this. So the devil's joke depends upon tracing the Greek letter lambda and its formal deformation. Like Descartes' evil genius, Poe's devil intervenes at the level of the signifier as a source of error that can go unnoticed and that is typographical. When the devil prompts Plato to write down onus estin aulos, he introduces into aulos a typographical oddity, right? The lambda is inverted, right? So the letter is in fact inverted horizontally. So if we pick up on this inversion, it is likely only when it is repeated a second time in correct form, right? Where the lambda is correct, and then we would actually read aulos. Transliterated, right, the sentence then reads, o nous estin aulos, right? But interestingly, the transliteration of the Greek, if you put the lambda to an L, then the inversion would no longer work, right? Because if you invert an L, depending at least on the typography, it wouldn't appear. So the devil has Plato write down the Greek without accent marks, right? And this has a disastrous effect as far as the meaning of the statement goes. So aulos, without accent marks, to parse its pronunciation, can mean either immaterial or flute, right? So the statement then means, the statement can read either the mind is a flute, right, or the mind is immaterial. And as Anthony Kemp notes in his essay, The Greek Joke and Poe's Bonbon, Poe introduces thus an additional pun, since the statement, the mind is immaterial, can either mean the mind is not of the same material as that of the body, or the mind is superfluous, right? Not important or of little consequence. So the complexity of the joke lies in the way in which the devil says something true because he exposes the false through the transcription of the letter falsely, the inverted lambda. And Poe alerts us to this by naming this letter, this non-letter, a lamma, right? So the lamma refers to, right, the truth that he uttered by accident, is what I'll argue, which would be this inverted lamma, which is in fact then a lamma. The devil thus corrects this truth by giving the lamma a fillip with his finger, turning the inverted lambda into an inverted gamma, right? The sentence then reads, o nous este augos, even though here the gamma is not even a gamma. So augos means light, right? So the mind is light, if it was correct, but the inverted gamma, right? But augos, when the gamma is inverted, introduces into the word, we could say, an illegibility, right? A letter without a place in the alphabet, right? So the first gives the devil a bad conscience, since he accidentally utters the truth by showing the false, right? It is false and thus true because it was falsely false. The second statement, despite also being false in form, states something true. It signifies the truth of Plato's doctrine and is thus false. Right? It is true and falsely stated, thus doubly true and doubly false. If the devil lets the truth slip in the first statement, that is because it is accidental and unintentional, a deviation, a clinamen that was not itself intended by the devil and thus needs to be corrected to signify something true and thus false within the devil's logic. So Bonbon is a story riddled with half-truths and flagrant contradictions, and from the outset the narration hints that we are dealing with a storyteller who is neither a lover of wisdom nor a lover of consistency. He is, however, a writer, attentive to the shape of words, the form of their appearance, their look on the page, and the sound of their enunciation, the feel they leave in the mouth as they are spoken. This is a language to be seen and heard before being understood, a story to be read with attention to the dough of words, to be read as if masticated, as if chewed. When one chews one's words, diction is a matter of syllable choice, choosing words for their matter more than their sense. For one who chews and not just chooses one's words, A word's meaning is unhinged from its sound and its look. Such a writer is not an evil genius, but a happy devil. One who believes in this devil need not be wretched in being bereft of all hope. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, many thanks, Alexi, for this intense presentation. Do we have questions immediately? Maybe you could just do, yeah, okay. Please.
If the devil deceives himself, what is the being of the devil?
Well, that would be, well, first of all, that's a great question. And I think in some sense that would be, I think the essential claim, which is, I think, is what occurs, right, is why he has to correct himself in order to utter a falsity, in order to avoid, in order to utter a truth that is false, in order to then utter a falsity that is true, and thus remain consistent with his being. But I think what's interesting here is that a devil that deceives himself, right, produces an inconsistency that reveals the truth of the devil, right, which is this sort of interruption of this circuit of we could say mirrored, the reversibility between falsity and truth, right, which is in fact what Descartes is playing upon in order to seize upon, right, a certainty that is embedded in the reflexivity of a doubt that in being enunciated cannot be itself doubted, right? So that what interrupts that in the end would be the action of the devil, which is an action that is in fact of his very substance, but that is not a substance, which would be the materiality of the letter, is the kind of the ultimate argument that I'm making. So the very fact that the materiality of the letter itself can undergo contingent deformations, right, that reveal something of the nature of inconsistency within the very movement of reason itself, but that reason itself can't speculatively recover.
Wouldn't this imply a certain identity, thoughts, and being precisely in the materiality of the letter? So to get back to, doesn't this mean fundamentally that the empty set includes itself?
Well, it would be that the empty set, so it's interesting because it would be, in some sense, I think it would be, to shift registers completely, it would be entering into, let's say, the debate between Lacan and Badiou about the univocity of the matheme, right? That in other words, I think the issue would be is that the devil is on the side of so-called natural language, precisely because artificial language, the language of the matheme, can produce, a univocity that is decided in advance, right? At least from the outset. However, there can be deformations that are introduced by accident, right? That the mathematician, of course, can introduce typographical errors. But the empty set, I think, is a fascinating one precisely because the typography of zero, right, if one imagines it in its ideality, right, would be precisely immune, right, or at least it presents itself as immune to typographical deformation, right? However, right, what I'm claiming is that there has to be some minimal material inscription of the letter, right, that would be a deviating, right, mark. So it would be the clinomen. So that it would be it's not the identity of being and nothingness, but it would be closer, let's say, again, to something like what is indicated by Democritus when he tries to sort of refer to the hing, right, or which gets translated as a hing, which would be the result of a non-word entered into the Greek with respect to Medon, right? So that the nothing, so it'd be like the thing or something. So that in other words, it can only be marked and registered by the introduction of a pure artifice that has no naturality, but that naturality marks, let's say, something like the event of a deviation, right? That can't be expunged from, our best efforts at producing artificial univocity. So in some ways, it wouldn't be the identity of the empty set and being, but rather being would be not identified with nothing, but precisely, let's say, the typographical deformation of the nothing that renders something like the thought of a difference between nothing and nothingness as a problem, right? So that, in other words, it'd be the fact that when the empty set wants to name the nothing as nothingness, right? Which would be then the seizure of zero. And this would be the flip side of that, or it would be the impossibility of that being made with absolute consistency.
Okay, Jan?
I'm a bit thrown out of my question. I actually wanted to ask before, now that your answer to Austrian, and I have to try to figure it out. But so what I thought, first of all, you were doing. So my first point was actually why are you bringing Descartes before you get to Spinoza? Why not the other way around? And then I thought, well, somehow you started with a problem of what is also inscribed into the Speech Act. No, I mean there's a problem of the cogito ergo sum, which already implies that there is a certain separation between the subject and itself as an object, to put it like this. So there is something thinking and being might not fall into one, and this opens the question for the devil, to put it short. And then you when you move on to Spinoza, I think you took this point from Descartes to a certain extent, namely because you refer to this problem of what do I speak about once I speak about the devil. And so I think you took this on. And my question is whether you, from Spinoza actually, whether the problem of the devil you're marking till there, later, is really, or in how much it is related to the question of being as one. This relates to the point of the empty set, but I'm actually thinking of something else. I mean, the question of that at a certain moment I thought you were, or let's say, I would like to know what relation you open up between the figure of the devil and something like non-being, because you could. I was wondering whether the figure of the devil, as you presented it, could be also stated as the figure of non-being. But I think you have something else in mind. It's something different. And I think this difference between non-being and the devil you were talking about is somehow linked to the question of the Speech Act, of that there is something that needs to be uttered. And this is, of course, then different. And then it returns as a fiction. And the philosopher is also returning as a fiction. And this, I think this is the figure you mainly present somehow. And of course, it's a complete crossing out of any possibility of, let's say, truth, for example. No? You somehow, it seems to me that you somehow go along with this, and it's an attempt to make it impossible to have, for example, a Badiousian claim to truth. No?
I would know. Well, okay. Well, I want to come because you said a lot. So, well, maybe I'll just quickly say that. No, I think that it would be consistent. It would be maybe saying that there would be this. I mean, the moment of inconsistency would be the revelation, or disclosure, or whatever the language one wants to be precise about, of the true that contravenes knowledge, right? That, in other words, the expulsion of the devil would be an effort to, let's say, guarantee, in very simple terms, the sanctity and precision of knowledge, right? Knowledge of, the subject's existence, or or for that matter, for Spinoza, just knowledge as such, right? As that, that in other words, it would, Spinoza's concept of truth would be this one that would be getting criticized, right? So that's, And so what I was interested in is the way in which the effort, the invocation of the devil, in the effort to expulse the devil, leaves a residue that reason, in its like eminent enlightened form, can't be done with, or can't actually reinstalls in the effort to expulse, you know, so that the movement of Descartes, I mean, so that there's a kind of also, I think, an implicit critique of that Spinoza, in a literal sense, is criticizing Descartes for being insufficiently enlightened because he wants to hypothesize the devil, and Spinoza is saying to be truly enlightened is to not even engage in such a hypothesis, because this in itself is a danger to reason, but at the same time, he nonetheless then tries to introduce a rational refutation of the devil, but in doing so, he actually interestingly has to invoke a sort of presence of the nothing, right, that then takes on the status of an inconsistency in language, right, that Spinoza himself cannot admit. So that this was the sort of the point that the devil becomes a pure signifier that signifies nothing, but what Spinoza can't think is the pure presence of this empty, nonsensical element, which would be just the name divested of anything but its material place. And so the eruption of that place, of the inconsistent, is kind of what I was trying to sort of trace, which would be then, in some sense, saying that, could say, is a kind of tracing out of how it is that the problem of the signifier as such, right, or the fragment of the signifier detached from any signification emerges as a problem at the heart of reason's effort to render itself consistent, right? That to me then would be an element of the true. So what I'm interested in is not, and I can see, like, I would have to maybe try to really work this out in a more considered way, is to say that there's two moments. One could see how, on the one hand, Derrida would maybe want to mobilize this element of the signifier as that of difference or something, right? That there's this sort of element of a pure, material inscription that in itself is like constantly undoing any possible attempts at reason, right? And I think what I'm trying to do is seize upon the way in which one can, for lack of a better term, objectify something that the present absence that is marked by the nonsensical element. So it'd be like a presence of nothingness, right? Which then begins to present itself as an obtrusion of its own presence, but of course it's the presence of nothing, right? So it sort of violates then the law of non-contradiction of something it either is or is not. But yeah, so yeah, I mean.
Okay, thanks a lot, Alexi. I mean, I don't want to interrupt this amazing discussion here, but we have to continue, in 55 minutes already, and it will be again in online. So we have to stop now, and yeah, thank you very much, and maybe we can continue while.
Yeah.